Evening, everyone. Yes, the sound check should be fine. Thank you. So we're going to have a little discussion about the MRP poll that dropped this week, as well as the aftermath, but something really curious, which is that we don't know who paid for it. I will begin, though. There was a little question at the beginning about, certain individuals on what we'd call the hard left who constantly sort of try and label Starmer red Tory, all the usual things. We've had it before. Thinking anecdotally that it seems to be on the wane. It's absolutely not on the wane. They're always there. They'll always be there. There are some people whom they attract that are not, they just want things to improve. So they tend to be a bit less effective at times, but they're always there and they'll never go away. So on to the topic in hand. Oh, just to point out, next week, by the way, there will be a little bit of a special guest, particularly for people interested in electoral reform, which I've never done before. So technically, let's just hope it all goes well. But for now, so this just to remind people, this MRP poll dropped last week. Now, we're used at the moment to getting voting intention polls. And whenever you see someone, including myself, who will say, oh, this would translate into this many seats for Labour and this many seats for the Conservatives and so on, it's always a bit of a fudge, because what we're doing is just putting raw voting intention results into an MRP calculator, very rough and ready. I use the one on electoral calculus. There are other ones as well. There is actually an app I have a link to, which allows you to fiddle with it with tactical voting as well. But I don't really know, I don't want to mess about with that. So just to say, whenever you see any of these results, it would be worse for the Tories with tactical voting. It doesn't take tactical voting into account, including these. But those polls are always very rough and ready. If it were looking like a tight election, you would just dismiss them. You wouldn't bother with them. What's the point? It's just that the Tories are so far out of it that even if the exact results are not quite right, you can still sort of go with it for a laugh. Whereas what we had dropped this week was a full dedicated MRP poll. 14,000 respondents and very detailed, and it did its field work across, obviously it's like any other poll, it's still a snapshot. It did its field work essentially across December. Because politics is in such flux at the moment, you could argue it's out of date immediately. But again, the Conservatives are in such dire straits that, it's still, it has very interesting things under the bonnet. But what was curious about this is YouGov didn't do this off their own back. It's a major undertaking. Someone commissioned them to do it. And that someone isn't Labour or anyone connected with Labour or anyone who wants Labour to win. We are told the people who paid for it are a collection of Tory donors, but we don't know who they are. Now, for legal purposes, if a poll is commissioned like this, there has to be someone who, like, a name has to go on it and a name has to be attached to it. The name was David Frost, Boris Johnson's former GIMP. And he's the one who, with a half-eaten packet of crayons, did that ridiculous analysis in the Daily Telegraph on Monday. It was Monday, wasn't it? On Monday, which YouGov had to instantly disown. I've got a link to the YouGov article in the description below if you've not already read it. And it goes through some of the headline figures. And then most of the article is them saying that the Daily Telegraph have basically butchered the analysis. The analysis was a complete nonsense. But the seat prediction, which we've got here, is what is based on this. Now, also, again, remember, this doesn't take tactical voting into account. So just really quickly, without going into all the detail, the way an MRP model works is you're analysing lots of different characteristics of voters. Your male, female, different age groups, different types of profession, attitudes to various things. you basically, you build up lots of little, oh, people with this characteristic tend to sort of do this, that, and the other, and you build up a model of the voting population, because you have to take into account the people who are more likely to vote as well. You build up this model of the voting population. You build up, you know, the spread of those characteristics within each individual constituency, and it allows you, instead of coming up with like some random figure for, oh, the Labour will win this many seats and the Conservatives this many, it allows you to predict on a constituency by constituency basis. And it really came into its own in 2017. This is when YouGov first produced this type of poll, and you know, they were the ones who got the result pretty bang on. They did pretty well in 2019, although the Conservatives were at the actual result was at the upper end of their views, but still. So that's what it does. As a result of it, it can't take tactical voting into account. So whatever this says up here, which at the moment is that Labour would win 385 seats, the Conservatives 169, and obviously lots of things will change between now and then, it's not taking tactical voting into account. And if you look at the actual, on the group, they've got an Excel spreadsheet that's got all the results on it. There's quite a lot of seats that have the Conservatives winning by like a few percent. Tactical voting will wipe that out. So that 169 seats for the Conservatives, it's why I describe it as optimistic. Unless something comes to their rescue, that's optimistic. Phil's suggesting there, Cruddas, yeah, Lord Cruddas, who's very much a Boris Johnson crony. It is entirely possible. What we know from the people who've backed it, because they've commissioned a poll that was clearly going to show the Conservatives are going to lose the election, and because they gave it to David Frost and the Telegraph to publish, it's nothing to do with them. It was given to them to do a hatchet job on Rishi Sunak. The Telegraph analysis, which YouGov had to rubbish because it was absolute claptrap, said that if Reform UK, basically the implication was, although they didn't necessarily say it in as many words, if Reform UK stood down, the Conservatives could win a number of seats that would put the whole thing into hung parliament territory. And the implication, again, they didn't say it out loud, the implication from there is, and if they can actually start to, you know, if they have a good campaign, well, they could turn it into a small win for themselves. Everyone knows the Conservatives not winning a big majority. I mean, they should know they're not winning anything. But, you know, it was a way of trying to nudge people to believe that even now it's possible for the Conservatives to somehow win the election, but they have to counter Reform UK. The implication being that they have to basically become Reform UK. That's what it's for. So the people who funded this, they didn't just fund it. They gave it to David Frost to do some bodged analysis, and they also gave it to the Telegraph to publish. It's clearly a group of people who want the Conservative Party to flip unpragmatically to the right, much more so than it already is. They obviously, presumably they're no fan of Rishi Sunak, who's resisting it, but they definitely are trying to give the impression that the Conservative Party basically needs to become Reform UK. That's what they're wanting. What is curious is they're not saying who they are. Because I find that very curious, because there are lots of Conservative donors who are quite happy to say they want the Conservatives to, you know, address the issues that Reform UK are raising. In other words, become more like Reform UK. There are Conservative donors who are saying Rishi Sunak's useless and we need Boris Johnson back. You know, there are lots of Conservative donors who are quite happy to say the party's not going in the direction they want and all the rest of it. So why are these ones so publicity shy? That is very interesting. And it's not good news for the Conservative Party either. The fact that you've basically got some Tory donors, influential Tories, keeping their identity secret, who are actively going to trip up their own party. In fact, the question we had at the beginning about why there are some on the hard left constantly trying to trip Labour up whenever they look like they want to win an election, tripping them up. This is the same thing for the Conservatives. This is a group on what we might call the hard right, the uncompromising right wing, who are effectively trying, and they're going to do it with much more effectiveness, trying to hold the Conservative Party hostage. And like I say, they can be more effective because they're just as organised, only they've got a load of money and they've already bought up the media as well. So they can be far more effective at and they've got a party ready to go. Reform UK is a very, very right-wing party that exists to high votes off the Conservatives. There is no similar thing for the left. For example, Labour has its votes split enough ways as it is. Have the Tories figured out that they've upset their key voters yet? Sort of, I think, yes. Let me find something here. So there's an article, I'm going to do a video on this tomorrow, but there's an article in Bloomberg today, which is talking about how, basically what has been happening over the last few months, it's been noticeable, more and more Conservatives in the media and in Parliament, as well as just others who have a voice, a platform, more and more Conservatives are expressing the fear that the Conservatives now cannot win the election. And this now, according to Bloomberg, includes Sunak's own allies. Even they are, and they're not just fearing losing the election, they're fearing wipeout. Because the focus from the Conservatives' point of view has been on 1992, because that's what they want to recreate. Because there was this real feeling in public that Labour were going to win that election. And then they didn't. And that's what they're trying to recreate. The problem is the conditions under the bonnet are just not there. I've done videos on that this week. But the fact that Sunak's allies are now fearing not losing, but wipeout. So they're now more, according to this article anyway, openly talking about not UK 1992, but Canada 1993, where their Conservative Party was in government. It was, and then it lost all but 2 of its seats. They lost over 150 seats. And the reason why they lost all those seats was, first of all, basically their vote was split all over the place. And the Conservatives in this country have, and I've said this before, they have never experienced that in modern history, shall we say. I'm not going to talk about 19th century politics. I'm not enough of an expert. Shall we say that post-war, roughly the last 100 years, the Conservatives have not had their vote really split. The way the Conservatives have operated is they have the right wing sewn up because there are no other right wing parties, and they scrap for the centre with Labour, the Lib Dems, other parties, nationalist parties in Scotland and Wales, for example. So that's what they do. So that's how they operate. They focus on the centre. In 2019, they abandoned the centre. That was the first time they consciously abandoned the centre, but they got away with it because the Lib Dems were absolutely atrocious and Labour had no interest in fighting for the centre either. So there was no battle in the centre of politics in 2019. Hence the results being absolutely mad. Whereas this time, Labour are now fighting for the centre again, as are the Lib Dems more sensibly. And the Conservatives have still abandoned the centre because their problem now is they can't just go, oh, we'd better now fight for the centre, because now they're being harried on their right flank. So they've been caught in a pincer and they've no experience of it. Individual Tory MPs have almost no Tory MPs have had experience of being in opposition, which means they don't even really know how to fight a disciplined Labour Party because they've not had it. There are some stalwarts in there, but they're batty. But none of them, it's completely outside of their experience to have this sort of pincer effect. It's never happened to them before. And assuming Reform UK do stand and they campaign properly, This coming election is going to be the very first election where the Conservatives are having their vote split on their left, not the left, their left, the centre ground, and their right, which is very far right. How will the hard right solve the cost of living in crumbling schools? Cost of living by letting people starve to death, and crumbling schools by letting them fall down because their private schools are fine. Actually, that's a bit of a lie. Eton had to close last week because of problems with the waterworks. But by and large, because of the flooding, basically, the toilets were not really operable. But by and large, their private schools are fine, so they don't give a shit about the rest. They would be more than happy. They sort of know they need workers these days to have some basic skills. They would be more than happy for the state to fund state schools for a few years, teach you to read and write, do a bit of maths, and then 10 years old, off you go to work. They'd be more than happy to do that. If they could work their will, they would do that. You'd basically have primary school. And don't bother teaching them history or anything like that. Teach them how to read and write. Teach them some basic computer skills. Just teach them what they need to know to work in their factories, really. That's all they would want. So they have no answers for any of these things. Tories haven't seen this since pre-Victoria. Yeah, I mean, there will have been times in the past. I mean, the Whigs, they were sort of progressive for their time, I suppose, but not how we would judge them now. So yes, I mean, and of course the Conservative and Unionist Party basically formed in its modern form in the 1830s, didn't it? 1834 or something. So you had like the Tory Party and the Peelers and so on. So politics has changed a great deal. But in modern times, the Conservatives have been used to only having to fight in the centre. They can forget about the right wing. They know the right wing will vote for them or not vote at all. They knew that there was a lot of voters on the right were not really going to vote for anyone else. So they could take so many votes for granted. If there was no one fighting for the centre in 2019, what were the Lib Dems fighting for? No, I didn't say they weren't fighting for it. I said they weren't effective. They had a leader who thought, right, for our campaign, what we're going to do, right, is we're going to put a giant picture of my face on the bus. Send that around. So it's not that they weren't in the centre, they just weren't effective. They were sat there having a picnic, and trying to see if there were any voters walking past going, oh, vote Lib Dem. No. Dominic Grieve has said that being in opposition for the first time was like skiing uphill. Well, I don't actually know Dominic Grieve's full parliamentary career offhand, but what I will say is this. So a lot of it, well, there's not going to be a lot of Tory MPs left, but of the Tory MPs who are left, a great many of them will have become MPs while Labour are in disarray. A lot of them actually became MPs in 2015 was a good year for the Tories. It's not just that they got a majority. Quite a lot of their influential Tories became MPs for the first time in 2015. Suella Braverman, for example, Rishi Sunak. So what's going to happen is you're going to have some Tory MPs who won their seats in 2010 or later. So they won their seats and went straight into government. Some of them literally into government. Some of them were made ministers instantly without any experience, although probably very, very like principal private secretaries or something first. But they've gone straight onto the government benches. So they're used to having influence over the government, right? They're used to being able to go to the Prime Minister, or at the least the Chief Whip, who has the ear of the Prime Minister. They had access to the government, right? Their own colleagues were the government. And what's going to happen to them after the election this year, whenever it is, May or November, but whenever it is, they're going to find themselves lost a little bit, because they're still going to be doing similar things. Like those who were just purely backbenchers are probably going to have... The Tories are going to be left with so few MPs, probably. I mean, we can't say, things might happen, but probably it might be that the Tories have to use almost all of them. There might not be any Tory backbenchers. There might be too few Tory MPs to cover all the shadow ministerial roles and still have some left over. Because really, you know, when you think about, like the way it was explained, I can't remember if it was Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, but, you know, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of that show. I still have it on DVD now. And the way it was described for government jobs is, Sir Humphrey would say, you know, about a third of the party are too young and inexperienced. A third of the party are too old and too silly, which leaves basically a third of the party left to fill up the government roles. So you don't actually, unless you've got a lot of MPs, unless you win a large majority, you don't have a lot of choice. And if you're in opposition and you've been badly beaten in opposition, you still don't have a lot of choice. Labour are on, I think they're on 190, no. It says Labour won 202 seats in the 2019 general election there, but that seems odd because I'm pretty sure they're on less than, obviously there's been some who've had the whip withdrawn, but about 200. And I think they're on 198 or something now, although after the next two by-elections, that should go up to 200 again. So they've got about 200. They haven't filled every shadow ministerial position. And it's because there are lots of Labour MPs you just can't put in that position. They either won't accept the job or you can't trust them in the job. So, yeah, the Tories are going to find themselves in a situation where they cannot have... First of all, their shadow ministers will have no say over policy. They've been used to having say over policy, no say. Secondly, they can't even cover all of Labour's ministers. They won't have the numbers. Because you're not going to let someone like John Redwood be a shadow minister, for goodness sake. So the proper loon is in it. And it's, they're going to struggle to really be an effective opposition. Not just because they're going to carry on tearing themselves apart. They won't have the numbers to really scrutinise Labour. And that's why, in broad terms, Labour having a really large majority isn't great for democracy because it means they're not going to get proper scrutiny. Now, that is not an argument for saying, well, let's not do so much tactical voting then, because remember what you're basically saying there is, if you'd refuse to vote tactically for whomever, let's say Labour in a seat where only Labour can win, then you're basically saying let's have more Tory MPs, which is never going to work. But just in general, this concept of having a main opposition that doesn't have enough MPs, which is again why proportional representation would be, you know, hugely beneficial. Puninator saying, I'm thinking the campaign might put Cameron front and centre, given he won in 2010, 2015. Is this possible? Depends what you mean by front and centre. If you mean, as Nadine Dorries is trying to claim, that there's a secret plot to make David Cameron the next Conservative leader, no, he can't be the next Conservative leader. That's it. He's shot his load now. The Conservatives have, in their constitution, their leader has to be an MP. So they can't even, without changing the constitution of the party, even select Boris, because the Boris Johnson fans say, well, make Boris Johnson the leader, then we'll find a by-election to get him back into Parliament. It's like, no, party rules. Can't do that. If there's a leadership contest, it has to be a sitting MP who is eligible for that leadership contest. Simple as that. So if Boris Johnson wants another crack at it, he's got to get himself back into the House of Commons. So then you'd think to yourself, well, so could David Cameron do the same thing? No, for two reasons. First of all, I don't think he wants to. I think he wants to be involved in politics. I get the impression he wants to be relevant again, but not to the. It doesn't want to get onto the House of Commons treadmill. Second problem is he's now a peer for life, a lord for life. You can't just give that up. It's mad. It's actually mad. The king can abdicate, but peers can't. Lords can't. You know, hereditary peers can. But I gather, and I'm not a constitutional expert, but I gather you can't really give up. Your peerage is a peerage for life. I don't think there's any way to give it up. And David Cameron cannot be a member of both the Lords. No one can be a member of both the Lords and the Commons. It's one or the other. And I don't think there's any way to give up a lifetime peerage. I think it's what it says on the tin, which is weird, but that's my understanding. I don't mean make him leader, but he does a lot of public speaking, may even stand a debate in Sunak's place. Right, so yeah, being involved in the campaign, yes, absolutely. The Conservatives at the moment have very, very few useful campaigners. Rishi Sunak is absolutely awful. What I would say, though, in terms of standing in debates, that would be an interesting move. It will be attacked, I would imagine, three ways. If I were advising Labour, I would say attack it three ways. First of all, Rishi Sunak's running away, right? First protocol. Rishi Sunak is running away. Now, of course, they tried that with Boris Johnson in 2019, but it didn't work too well because he was ahead. He was playing a defensive game. Rishi Sunak is behind, so it cuts through to the public more if Rishi Sunak isn't turning up. You can also use as a bonus line against him that he doesn't feel that he should be answerable to the public, that he's not taking questions from the public. He thinks he's above it, so he's sending an underling. Second line of attack is by bringing David Cameron. It's like a has-been. It's a tilt to the past. Rishi Sunak saying, oh, we don't want to go back to square one. Labour can say, well, actually, square one was when we were in charge. Yeah, we do. But also square one, arguably, was when David Cameron became Prime Minister. So by bringing that square one back, they're sort of undermining their own position. And the third thing is that David Cameron's a peer. He's not elected. They can attack the fact that the Conservatives have 360-ish elected members of the House of Commons, including Rishi Sunak himself, and they have sent a Lord, someone they made a Lord specifically to get into cabinet. It just emphasises the undemocratic nature of Cameron's appointment. I think it would be a bad move even though David Cameron can handle himself in a debate reasonably well, certainly better than most of the cabinet, there would be so many obstacles to doing so. I don't think a Tory strategist could advise it. However, being involved in the campaign in certain areas, remember there are lots of parts of the country where David Cameron is stunningly unpopular. You wouldn't send him to the Red Wall, for example. But there will be some Tory areas that they can send David Cameron to, yes, absolutely. Cameron fleed after the election? No, he can't. As I say, he doesn't want to, and it's not actually possible. It's no longer possible. David Cameron ran away, Boris ran away, Sunak's only following a noble tradition for Tories. Yes, indeed. Not so noble, though. What do I think of House of Lords will be named after reform if members will be elected, of course? Yeah, well, this is the problem. In fact, I'm going to do another video, although I may just do this for the Labour Social channel. I don't know. I have a problem with an article I've been reading today. So the House of Lords, as a revising chamber, for many years, it was absolutely fine. I had no issue with it. I had no great desire to see it reformed. Labour changed it a bit when they were in power last time. I wasn't in favour. I wasn't terribly opposed, but I didn't care that much. Nowadays, I actually want it abolished. I've completely changed. It's not that I've changed my mind. It's the circumstances have changed. So I do want it abolished now. I understand the difficulty. I am disappointed that Labour aren't fully committed. If they would at least say we are going to do this, but it may take 2 terms, I'd be fine with that. But what's happening with Labour is they're saying, oh, we don't think we can do this in the first term. So what we might do is remove hereditary peers, as in not sack them. The hereditary peers that are there now say, well, you can stay, but you do not then get to bequeath your title to your eldest child. So that's what Labour are talking about at the moment. And you think, okay, and what else? Oh, that's it? No, that's not good enough. If Labour are serious, I know Starmer's serious, but again, it's not just about him. If Labour are serious, and I'm not convinced they are, what they will want to do is get it ready for replacement in the second term. And if all they do is say, yeah, hereditary peers, the ones in the Lords now are going to be the last lot. Once they die off, that's it. They're not going to pass it on to their offspring. That's not enough. You can do more than that. You may not be able to replace the chamber inside one parliament, but you can do more than that. And I'll tell you what's brought it particularly to mind. There is an article in the Financial Times, actually, but it's the sort of thing that I'm sure will be discussed in other outlets as well, that suggests that the Rwanda bill is going to go through the House of Lords. Or at least that Labour are not going to hold it up. Now, the reasoning is strategic in that it says in this article that Labour, first of all, there's a problem with Labour. They don't really have much representation in the House of Lords. Most Labour peers are really old now. Their bones are basically dust. So they can't actually make late night debates. I mean, there have been times where there's been some votes where Labour, it's like, well, where are the Labour peers for this vote? And sometimes they've just been told to abstain and not get involved. But quite a lot of the time, it's because they're too old. They're too old to be able to put in hours and hours of debate and voting in the House of Lords. They're not up to it. And that is where part of this idea of a revising chamber falls flat. Because these positions are for life, whether you're hereditary or just a made-a-life peer, you know, they tend to be on the older side because most people elected to the Lords, I say elected, you know, appointed, I should say, to the Lords, are people who, most of the suitable ones are already elderly, because what makes them suitable is a long career in politics or in business or in law or, you know, in a trade union, things like that. So they're already elderly when they enter the House of Lords. And given that Labour have not been in a, you know, the last time they threw in a load of Labour peers was 2007, they're all really old now. Whereas the Conservatives have been throwing young people in, including someone who wasn't even pissing 30 at the time. So what Labour are saying is, first of all, they don't have the peers to stand up to late nights, and they fear that if they block this bill, that the Tories will have an excuse to block Labour's bills when they're in power. And that is basically being held hostage. That is Labour opposing this Rwanda bill, being unable to oppose it in the Lords because they're effectively being held hostage. And it's as I say, it's a consequence of the fact that they just and the thing is, it shouldn't give the green light to the Tories to block Labour's legislation in the House of Lords, because this Rwanda bill doesn't have a public mandate. It may be the elected House of Commons that sent it to the Lords, but it is not as a result of public approval. It's not been in the manifesto. There's no mandate for it. It's absolutely outrageous. And also, what's to stop the Tories doing that anyway? Let's say Labour go, okay, we're a bit worried about the Tories blocking our legislation when we're in power, so we won't block theirs. Well, what if they do anyway, because they're scurrilous? Am I claiming the young woman Johnson put in wasn't suitable? I'm not sure that anyone that Johnson put into the House of Lords was suitable. There are, I mean, I never complain. So the following people, if they're put into the House of Lords, I'll never complain, even if I think they're personally unsuitable. So people who have had experience, a lot of parliamentary experience, either as a chair of select committee or as a senior minister, Secretary of State, say. So people like that, if they want to send them to House of Lords, I have no issue. So ironically, if Nadine Dorries had found herself in the House of Lords, I wouldn't have complained. Because although, yes, she is unsuitable, she meets one of my criteria. Then there are other criteria as well. For example, if they've served in a senior position in a trade union for a long time, if they have, you know, been not just a successful business, but a business leader. So they've taken a role in representing their industry. That's fine. Senior judges, senior lawyers, yeah, absolutely, because at the end of the day, their job is to revise legislation. So people who are trained and experienced in it. These are the sorts of people, even if I think the individual is a wrong un, I won't complain about because they are qualified. Even though you are stretching a point if you say Nadine Dorries. But I can't think of any way of fairly excluding Nadine Dorries from my list of suitable peers. But when you put people into the House of Lords who have a long and distinguished career in cricket and cricket commentary, or a long and indistinguished career in running shady think tanks, no. Even like political strategists, no. You know, they should be people who have served as senior members of Parliament, either as a chair of a select committee or as a senior minister or shadow minister, because they have a lot of experience scrutinising legislation. Naturally, they've earned their stripes. You know, business leaders, trade unionists, judges, you know, lawyers basically, judges and barristers and solicitors. Those are the sorts of people. Anyone, I'm not saying you'd rule out anyone else, but, you know, they'd really have to. I mean, maybe a top campaigner, a successful campaigner. But by and large, the people that Boris Johnson's been sending in don't meet those criteria. They don't meet them at all. This is like Trump stuff in the Supreme Court with his cronies. Well, that's the other thing, you see. People wondered if Keir Starmer would just do the same thing and throw a load of young Labour peers in. The problem with it is the House of Lords is already bloated. There are more peers in the House of Lords than there are MPs in the House of Commons. A lot more as well. So actually, more than half, I mean, these Brexiteers talk about the unelected EU all the time. More than half of our parliament are unelected. What if there's legislation for reform in the sport of cricket? Then they can invite Ian Botham along because they do invite experts in to give evidence at the committee stages of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So he can pop along, but he's not used to reading legislation. Ian Botham is not qualified to revise legislation. You know, if there is some legislation referencing cricket, he can come along as a cricket expert, but he is not an expert at revising legislation. He has been sent to the House of Lords to vote a particular way, a way that people have told him to vote. That's wrong. Can't think of a way to block Nadine Dorries. Fairly, how about an IQ test is required? You have to get at least 80. No, that'd just be mean. Also, IQ tests are themselves subjective as well a bit, aren't they? They're quite cultural. So, and as we know, you know, Nadine Dorries has about as much culture in her entire body as I've got in my little fingernail. Well, Angry Pagan say, what have Labour said on military policy? Tories have shrunk ours more and more. As little as possible, as far as I can tell. Yes, the issue for Labour will be that, yes, the Tories are absolutely, they've decimated our military. In fact, there was an article today with, you know, an American basically saying Britain as an ally is not what it used to be. Have you heard today one of our ships crashed into another in the Middle East? You know, I think there were minesweepers. We had a ship crash into one of our own ships. What had happened, I gather, although I've not looked into it into detail, is there was a refit done by a contractor, presumably hired by Dodgy Dave, and they got the gears mixed up. So when one of the boats tried to engage like the forward gear, it actually went into reverse. So yeah, one of our naval ships has basically crashed a hole into the hull of another. We just look like clowns. We look like absolute clowns on the world stage. We do still have a large military, you know, by the standards of like virtually every country in the world. But yeah, it is much depleted. But there we go. Cricket expert was made leader of Pakistan, wasn't he? Yeah, I think isn't he in prison now though? Didn't work out well for him, did it? But yeah, Labour's position, I strongly suspect, is to say as little as possible, because on the one hand, yes, we need an effective military, but at the same time, from Labour's point of view, two things. First of all, when we use it, we tend not to cover ourselves in glory. And second of all, they need the money for other things. I'm not saying I am in favour of allowing the defence budget to remain very low. I think that's short-sighted. But at the same time, Labour have got... It's not going to win Labour any votes if they build the military back up, is it? No voter's going to notice any link between a boosted military, particularly in the short term, and any benefit to them. And all the sorts of voters who would cheer on a beefed up military without seeing the direct benefit, those are the sort of people who tend not to vote Labour. So I suspect that Labour will not really want to answer too many questions about that. I certainly haven't seen any policies on it. Or if I did, I don't remember them. So yeah, I think Labour's policy on military spending will be to say as little about military spending as possible. Although, of course, they are going to have to present some costed plans in their manifesto. Stop hereditary peers and you hit the hereditary monarchy. No, you don't. There's no need for that at all, because the monarch is not really part of government. Government has three branches. The monarch is not any part of them. Whereas the peers in the House of Lords are part of the legislature. Breathalyzer test for Nadine Dorris. Yeah, we may have to... Actually, that could get the numbers of peers down. If we had breathalyzer tests for them all, we could end up with about 3 left in the House of Lords. Also, Parliament is massive. The US has a far larger population, yet only have 538 Congress 100 senators. Well, hold on a minute. America, I don't think you can necessarily compare to America, because America has a very... I was going to say advanced. I'm not sure that's the right word these days. But it does have a very committed system of local devolution, effectively. Each individual state has its own legislature, which is quite powerful. We don't have that. Scotland has one, which is, sort of on the same level as a state legislature in America. And Wales has one, which is not quite as powerful, but, is getting there. Stormont has one which is less powerful still. There's none in England. I mean, you've got elected mayors. That's not the same thing. America have elected mayors. So that's a separate thing. So I don't think it's necessarily right to point at the number of national legislators in America, because you've got to remember an awful lot of powers are devolved at the state level. And they have a state legislature. So if you count up the number of legislators in America, even per capita, I strongly suspect it's not higher than in this country. Because remember, you can't equate that with local councillors. Councillors don't make the odd bylaw, but there's very little power to do anything. Military are going to be drones and robots soon. It's all we can afford. Can't build planes and navy ships without steel. No. It's actually quite funny, because some Tories were hailing the fact, some Brexiteers weirdly, hailing the fact that Poland is going to build some ships, some naval ships, to British plans, using British plans for them. And they're cheering this on. And I'm thinking, okay, fine. I mean, first of all, it's not, I don't know why they're trying to link it with Brexit. It's not a Brexit benefit, because we developed these plans before Brexit. But secondly, it's like, okay, so they're going to use British designs. Right, okay. They're not going to ask Britain to build these ships then. No, they're just going to use our plans, and someone else will build them. There was a time when we used to cheer the fact that some foreign country wanted us to build their ships. Now it's, oh, they're going to make them look the same. Great, that's where we are now. We're cheering that. Britain's defence policy on spending is don't talk about defence spending, almost literally first rule of Fight Club. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know that Labour, that's just me speculating here. But, and also traditionally Labour tend not to talk much about defence anyway. It doesn't really win over their voters. They're more interested in healthcare, the economy, and education, housing. You know, in fact, almost anything other than defence. Do you know what? It might be worth having a quick little look. Let me, and I'll try and put this on the screen as well, because I refer to this quite frequently. When was this last updated? Oh, it's been updated this week. Oh, excellent. Right, so let me just, I'm going to cover myself up so you can see it in some decent detail. Although I won't put the key on because that will, oh, come here. Right, so I'm just going to cover myself up for a bit. Put it down there. So this is showing some top issues. Now, I'll have to read out the key to you. So let's put some in. So what we've got, health in pink, immigration, asylum, crime. Let's get rid of crime because crime's always rubbish. And we'll put in defence. Where's defence? Defence and security. Let's just clear out the clutter. So I'm leaving health, immigration, asylum, and the economy, and defence and security. Right, oops, let's put that there. Defence and security is that one on 14% at the bottom. This is for voters in general, right? So what I can do is I can change it to specifically Conservative voters. This is 2019 Conservative voters. So 23% of them think defence is a top issue, right? Unsurprising, higher than the average. If I put it on late, and I haven't done this in advance, so I might look silly. No. If I do it on for Labour, 6%. So that is the difference in issues. It's also why, actually, just while we're here, I may as well point out why Rishi Sunak chasing this asylum nonsense is not a wedge issue with Labour. Look at it. For the Conservatives, go back to the Conservatives, it's this purple one at the top. 63% of 2019 Conservative voters think immigration asylum is a top issue. They didn't used to. Look back here. Back here, about 20 odd percent, not even a quarter of people, when we were busy with COVID, thought it was a top issue. Now, back to it being a top issue. And the top issue, higher than the economy, higher than healthcare, higher than defence, higher than anything. Labour, immigration and asylum, 16%. 16%. So that's why Labour can talk so clearly about it. It's absolutely brilliant. And bear in mind, not everyone who thinks asylum and immigration is a top issue is in favour of the Rwanda bill. There are some people who think asylum and immigration is a top issue who are dead against it. So, the difference, it's always worth looking at things like this. The difference it makes when you look at Labour and Conservative voters. Now, we'll just point out where you have to not fall down a trap here. Is these are 2019 Labour voters. Now, remember, 2019 Labour voters, Labour need to win more than just those over. So when you're looking at this actually is less important for Labour. The 6% is defence and security. So again, it's not a vote winner for Labour to talk about it. People aren't interested. Even people in general, because Labour need to, it's 14%. It's not a top issue for people. It's not a top issue at all. It's not even a top issue for Conservative voters. So, there's nothing to be gained by really making a big deal of defence. But, whereas the Conservative vote, this is more meaningful because the Conservatives essentially, they know they're not winning very many new voters. So their job is to essentially retain as many of their still living older voters as they can. I'm just going to get rid of this now because it's covering me up. If our military troop levels were where they were in 2010, I'd be a lot happier. Yeah, well, again, it's another thing that the Tories have reduced our capacity in. And it's absolutely mad because, as you can see on that thing, defence is a much bigger issue for Conservative voters than Labour voters. And yet the Conservatives have diminished our military. Certainly military personnel, but even capacity. When you've got the Americans saying that we're not as useful as we were, You know, they're basing that on our combat effectiveness. And as I say, today we had a ship crash into another ship, which wasn't great. Wasn't the fault of those on board. As I say, they had a dodgy refit that swapped the wires round or something on the forward and reverse gears. Warren Peg is saying it's part of that 6%. Is that big spike Brexit? Oh yeah, everything. Well, okay, let me put it back up. Sorry, hold on. There we go. I mean, I mean, you can see this is September 2015. That's before the Brexit referendum, but it's when the campaign was in, because this is when David Cameron, roughly there, won his majority. Remember, he promised a Brexit referendum. So look what happened instantly. The media and the Brexit groups instantly swung into action. All of a sudden, the public started, in fact, even if I put it into all adults, the spike's not as large, but it's still there. You know, of people in general, 71% all of a sudden thought immigration asylum was a top issue. And it started when Cameron won that election. Again, the idea that the media do not drive public opinions, you know, that it's so obvious. You can see it. You know, you can see this. But I'll tell you what's, and this is why I keep saying how stupid Rishi Sunak's been. Look at this rise in immigration here, but it's more pronounced for Conservative voters. So this major increase, right? Because look at here. So it was sort of going up after COVID, and then after 2021, it started to decline in importance, and, you know, it's fiddled about. And then it jumps up here. And where it jumps up is Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak had the chance to drop the Rwanda bill. They'd have been people chuntering, but he could have just dropped it. And he could have decided not to talk about asylum and immigration. Just not talk about it. Don't bother with it. Every now and then some official figures will come out and the media will go mad, and it'll last for a couple of weeks and then it'll go away again. The government have been driving this. The media alone can't do it, because the media need to be able to pretend to promote news. They can only write opinion pieces for so long. If the government do not give them the oxygen needed to keep the story running, then they have to stop reporting on it, because there's nothing to report on. Nothing at all. What are my list of priorities to focus on? Personally, I go NHS, economy, education, immigration. So I drilled down, first of all. So actually, after the election, I'm not jinxing it. After the election, when the results are in, I am going to do a video where I explain, because I always say, as a Labour supporter, as a Labour member, I have one job for the Labour leader in opposition, form a government. That's it. I have no other jobs for them. Whatever, within reason, they can do whatever they like, as long as whatever they're doing is helping them form a government. That is all I ask. In government, I have more jobs for them. I am not content for them to simply look like they're... So when Keir Starmer is Prime Minister, I'm not going to then say, I only want Keir Starmer to make sure he's also going to win the next election. No. He has things to do. And to be... Being fair, I am going to create a list of metrics that I'm going to track them on. So if I take it, and it will cover all important policy areas for me. It won't actually include defence, I have to say. I'm saying it's not an important issue, but it's not an important one for me. So for the NHS, for example, I will actually want to focus on three types of waiting times. I'm not so bothered about waiting lists, but I will also track them because it'll be the easiest data to find. But I will be interested in waiting times. How long are people waiting for a GP appointment? How long are people waiting to get seen in A&E? And how long are people waiting for elective surgery? Well, diagnosis and elective surgery, I should say. Diagnosis matters as well. Because at the moment, there's people who can afford it having to go private to get a diagnosis. Then once they've got the diagnosis, go to the NHS where they can jump ahead of everyone else waiting for a diagnosis on the NHS, which is a two-tier system, and that's wrong. Shouldn't be able to do that. So that's my focus for the NHS. There's lots of other things you could talk about as well. That's my focus for the NHS. For the economy, it's much more difficult. So my focus there will be, I suppose, inward investment has to be part of it. In other words, are they, because what my focus will be is removing trade barriers, but how do you measure that? So you have to measure it in terms of the impact for businesses. So in terms of, you could do it in terms of inward investment, you could do it in terms of tax revenues generated from business profits, because that also links in with, are they making businesses pay taxes properly as well, the ones who try and fiddle it? You know, there are all sorts of things you can do. On housing, it's obvious. How many houses are getting completed? On housing also, you could say, what is the cost, the average cost of a house as a proportion of average income? So for that, you can get that to come down by either making sure the supply of houses is sufficient and or making sure people's salaries go up. Talking of which, average incomes, are they going up with inflation or are they below inflation still? That'll be another key marker. But to be fair for that one, there are some of my metrics where it may take a few years. But there will also be others where I expect it to happen much, much simpler there. If forward and reverse was switched, how did it get to the Gulf? No, I think the refit was done in dock. Can I find quickly, because we are running out of time. Let me see if I can find really quickly where I saw it. And I haven't looked at the details. It was just something I clocked today, and I haven't followed it up because there's been lots of other things to read today. I'm not sure how easily I'll find it. I may have to give up on this one. Oh. No, I'll have to, sorry, let's find it out. But yeah, I think the refit was done there, and it's when they were moving out, they were moving away from the port, it happened. Couldn't unforeseen circumstances like foreign wars also affect Starmer's tenure. Lots of things can affect it. I'll read the rest of it, sorry. The PM not only governs the country, but our leader on the world stage. Lots of things can affect it. Lots of things. I mean, you know, any notion that, okay, Labour have got these plans, they're going to put these plans into effect and then everything will be marvellous. Any sort of thinking like that is very, very loose. We could have a banking crash straight away. We could have a global banking crisis again in 2025. That'll knacker that, won't it? I'm not saying they will necessarily then lose, but yes, something could screw Labour over immediately. The Tories had 10 stable years of the world being stable, relatively stable. They had 10 years, and so did Labour. Labour came in. From 97, the banking crash started in 2007, really, and then really hit in 2008. So both Labour and the Conservatives had a good 10 years of like steadiness for them to implement things. It's just that Labour used that time to implement things, and the Tories didn't. The next Labour government might not get that long. I mean, let's be honest, this decade so far has been an absolute disaster, hasn't it? The world is going crazy due to both natural and man-made tragedies. Yes, Labour could easily get distracted, not just be knocked off course. It could actually just get distracted, because that happens as well. You know, Prime Minister has all these plans, then something happens that demands their attention, and they take their eye off the ball with other things. Now, yes, I know you've got ministers who are supposed to stay, but you need the Prime Minister to keep giving them a steer on it. That's the Prime Minister's job ultimately, to make sure that their ministers, their government is all pulling in the same direction. You know, that they can't afford to take their eye off the ball. Because what will happen is an individual minister will prioritise, but their priorities may not be the overall government's priorities, right? So you can't just leave your ministers to it. So if you end up with Starmer being too busy on the world stage, he's not paying attention back home. But anyway. It says, Starmer already has more respect from world leaders, has been working on building relationships abroad. Yeah, but let's be fair, Larry the Cat's got more, got a better reputation abroad than our current Prime Minister. I mean, apart from anything else, I'm not going to try and come up with excuses here because I read this report about the House of Lords, certainly from Labour's point of view, ultimately revising the Rwanda bill, but ultimately not blocking it. I'm not going to come up with excuses for that. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. But you do also wonder, does it backfire on the Tories or does it backfire on Labour? Because it's something that hurts our international reputation, that Rwanda bill. So I am still hoping the House of Lords revises it to the point where it complies with international laws and doesn't budge on that. Whether or not Labour peers can be asked for the late nights on it or not. But there we go. David saying, I'll still prioritise Leveson 2 and then some. Right, yes. So media reform, absolutely. Media reform, electoral reform. Electoral reform is the most important, but Labour can easily, they can do both. Media reform, absolutely. And Leveson 2, for me, I mean, it depends what you mean by that. For me, it means a brand new public inquiry. Brand new. Bring it right up to date. Because in actual fact, I think media regulation should be revised every 10 years anyway. Maybe just have it as a course of action. Now, I know that creates a danger that then the Conservatives have an excuse to revise it back down. But again, as long as you bring in proportional representation, then that's no longer an issue. And I will just, for my final point, run out of time. I will just point out that we're going to have normally I don't decide the topic for the Saturday video because it depends on like breaking news and stuff. It is set in stone. Next Saturday is going to be on proportional representation, specifically proportional representation, the campaign within Labour. So that is going to be the topic for next week. Obviously, in the last half hour, I'll still take other questions, like discuss other things. But certainly the first half of it, at least, is going to be on proportional representation as seen from within Labour. But anyway, there we go. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a very good evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.